Today I'm sitting next to the spinet because it is tuned to meantone and I need it for demonstration purposes. This video is about a remake of a chaconne by the French Baroque composer Geoffroy. And the reason I have decided to record it again is because I felt that in the first recording I tried to make the piece into something that now at least I feel it is not. Let me explain what I mean by that. I would imagine that a lot of people have either not even heard of Geoffroy as a composer, or if they have heard of him, they may not have actually heard any of his compositions. And I have to admit that he was also unknown to me until a few years ago. I knew the name, but I hadn't actually listened to any of his music. And one thing that I found out as I was trying to figure out a little bit more about this composer is that some commentators seem to think that his music is not consistently good, that there are a lot of pieces in his output that are simply not that great. So, of course, that made me even a little more curious about him, and I decided to start exploring on my own. Now, I haven't been able to find a lot of his music in score, so I can't say that his music is either good or not good. However, what I would say is that the music that I have looked at seems to me to be wonderful. However, there does seem to be an interesting feature of some of his music. And I don't know if this is what some commentators identify as a weakness. What I have found in his music, in some of his pieces, is that everything seems to start out fine, but then at some point in time before the end of the piece, it's almost as if the texture starts petering out. Almost as if one has a skeleton of a piece that one needs to fill in, as if the composer was moving along and then suddenly he kind of gave up on the ideas, and we just have these very, very few notes that kind of carry us towards the end of the piece, to the conclusion of the piece. This is indeed what is happening in this chaconne, and it happens at the very last verse. Before I go into this, I should say that in common with many of the chaconnes of the French Baroque, this one is really in rondo form. So we have the refrain, and then we have four different, shall we say, verses. And the problem here, if you want to call it a problem, really occurs in the very last verse, right before the return of the final refrain. What happens is that the verse, this fourth and final verse, starts out very nicely, but then indeed the texture starts petering out. The right hand ends up having some sort of a half-step oscillation between the A and the B flat, and then the left hand itself also seems to disintegrate, shall we say, and gets its own kinds of oscillations. Now, for my first recording, I tried to somehow account for this discrepancy, this disintegration of what was happening by speeding up. I felt that I needed to do something to make that part convincing, and I'm not so sure anymore that this is necessary. So for this recording, I decided, first of all, to really try to express what I could with what Geoffroy has provided. As of course with every piece of Baroque music, I don't play exactly what I see on the page, but on the other hand, I don't engage in speeding up or anything like that. So I try to keep the tempo consistent, of course flexible but consistent, and I simply try to play what I see. I don't do any changes of registration or anything like that. However, there's one thing that is quite interesting in this particular verse, and this is when the left hand peters out, eventually it starts doing its little oscillation, just as the right hand is oscillating in a half step, this thing. You could almost imagine it as a trill, except that it's very slow. I didn't make it into a trill in the performance. So the left hand has its own oscillations, but eventually comes to settle in a particular oscillation between these two notes. I'm not naming them yet, and I'm not playing them yet. This is the issue here. Those notes, of course, are C sharp and D sharp, or if you want to think of them as D flat and E flat. However, Geoffroy does not notate them that way. He does something very strange. He notates them as C sharp and E flat. Now, this is, of course, very unusual. However, what I started thinking is that in case Geoffroy is thinking here of these particular pitches, C sharp and E flat, and not their enharmonic equivalents, then I thought that I would tune the harpsichord to meantone and perform the piece in meantone. And indeed, at that spot, you get a very, very nice crunch, because in meantone, we don't have enharmonics. What I mean by this is, I'm doing this an octave higher so you can see it a little better. I know that the angle is not ideal. When we look at what on the piano we call the black keys, and here are the white keys, the accidental keys, we think of them as having two different identities. So this, for example, is C sharp, but it's also D flat. This one here is D sharp, but also E flat. This is not how things work in meantone and in many other unequal temperaments. The accidental keys have one and only one identity. And in this particular case, in meantone, this note is C sharp, and this one is E flat. Exactly, in other words, the way Geoffroy notated them. And when I play them together, when I do this oscillation, you will notice that it doesn't really sound like what we consider a whole step, because it's a little wider than that. It's a true C sharp to E flat. And of course, Geoffroy notates it in this octave, in this range. So that when you play this along with the A to B flat oscillation in the right hand, you get this wonderful tense harmony. And I feel that when I was using meantone, it really gave the piece this extra dimension that really made it very, very special. And I felt that I didn't need to do anything else. I didn't need to intervene, shall we say, to make the piece convincing. Now, of course, it would be wonderful if I could say that, yes, what this piece needs is indeed a meantone temperament. However, what makes things a little weirder, and I would say deepens the mystery here, like what would Geoffroy really, what did he really want? This piece also exists in an F minor version. And of course, F minor has A flats, and in this particular meantone temperament, this unfortunately is not an A flat, it's a G sharp. And he also does something very, very strange. That moment where he notates as a C sharp to E flat, in the F minor version, he notates this as a B to D flat. And of course, in this particular meantone temperament I'm using, I don't have a D flat either. So I'm not going to claim here that what I'm doing, that I'm using meantone temperament, is what Geoffroy had in mind. I think it fits with the notes, with the accidentals that he has supplied in this particular G minor version of the piece. However, as I said, the fact that this piece also exists in F minor kind of complicates matters. So I can't say that what I'm doing is exactly what Geoffroy had in mind. I find that the way I play the piece now in meantone temperament and without that kind of intervention that I did a few years ago when I first recorded it, I find that the piece is much more convincing to me as a performer. I am going to leave the first performance that I did. It's still on my YouTube channel, so if you go back a few years in time, it's still there for you to listen to and to see what I have done and compare it with the one that you're about to hear. And I leave it up to you to decide which one you find more convincing. I find that I'm much happier with this new version of the piece. So that was the little explanation for the Chaconne in G minor by Geoffroy. I hope you enjoyed the performance, and as always, thank you very much for watching.